everybody. I hope you're having a great opening plenary. Thank you all so much for coming, and thank you so much, Edgar, for joining me on stage today. Edgar Villanueva is the author of Decolonizing Wealth, which is a provocative and really beautifully written analysis of the colonial attitudes that are really present in philanthropy and more generally in finance, and the impact that these attitudes have on these sectors. And also he talks a lot about how money can be used not just to divide and exploit, but also to heal. So first of all, thank you so much, Edgar, for being here today and for agreeing to talk about your book.
Absolutely, it's an honor to be here with you guys.
So in your book, you talk a lot about three aspects of your identity in particular. One is your being Native American. Two is your being Southern, and three is your choosing a life in philanthropy. I'd love to know a little bit more about why these identities are so core to who you are and how you operate in the world.
Wow, well, what a combo of identities, right? My identity is really important to me for a lot of reasons. Another identity that I have is that I'm the son of a domestic worker. So I'm feeling a little emotional from that last conversation. It was so beautiful. So yes, my identity as a Native American, as someone who's from the US South, is really important because for the most part, indigenous people around the world are very invisible. And especially in the United States, Native Americans are quite invisible, particularly in the US South, where we were the first point of contact for colonization. And so actually being a part of maintaining that identity and, especially working in a space that has had, quite a bit of forced assimilation to how I show up as a leader, working with a lot of people with wealth and institutions with wealth, being grounded in that identity of where I'm from and remembering that and bringing that with me into the work has really shaped my analysis around how I do this, how I show up as a leader.
Yeah, I love the concept of, the forced assimilation in philanthropy. I feel like there is just such a tending towards the norm that you often see, which you bring up a lot. You also, the core of the book is really about colonization and decolonization. Of course, that's the title. So why use these terms that, for so many people are very provocative? What's the power of talking about wealth in these kinds of ways?
Well, I had to go on my own journey to learn about colonization, although I'm Native American, because when I was growing up in school, we were not taught the accurate history of the United States. I sort of bought into the fantasy that, pilgrims came over and that my ancestors met them there and we all sat down and ate turkey together, and so it wasn't until much later in life that I actually learned the accurate history of what happened in the United States. And it's a dark history that folks don't want to revisit often. It's easy to kind of sweep it under the carpet and want to look forward. But what I realized as an adult is that there's a lot of trauma in my community, in my immediate family. We have mass incarceration and abuse. We see, violence and a lack of education. I'm the first person in my family to graduate from high school. And so these cycles of trauma that exist in indigenous communities, and my tribe is the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, are the result of a history that was not that long ago. Actually, my grandparents' generation, Native children were forcibly removed from their homes and put in boarding schools and not allowed to speak the language and not allowed to identify with the culture. And so those types of atrocities, colonization is absolutely an atrocity, have lingering impacts. And as we're thinking about the future and talking about progress, we have to do that with the lens of, well, what is the historical context of the issues that we're trying to solve? Because that history, whether we are honest about it, whether it makes us uncomfortable, whether we are kind of agnostic to it, the history happened and it is absolutely connected to the problems that we're trying to solve current day.
How do you think the history is connected specifically to philanthropy?
So, in philanthropy, there's a lot of manifestations of what I call the colonizing virus. So we often think of colonization as something in the US that started 500 years ago. And it's often something that we think of with pride. In fact, there was a study that I referenced in my book in the UK from 2014 that interviewed folks in this country about their impressions about colonization and Great Britain's history with the British Empire. In the 20s, not that long ago, this country controlled a third or a fourth of the world's population and controlled about a fifth of land. And most people responded, about 59% of those respondents in that survey said that colonization was a good thing and the world is better off. And so there's a mindset that I liken to a virus that still is being perpetuated, and it shows up in our policies and our systems and who gets to be a leader, who is esteemed as an expert, who gets to control, allocate, and manage wealth. And so as it pertains to philanthropy, colonization was about accumulating wealth, right? And so fast forward to present day with foundations and folks who are investors, there's a history there about how that wealth was accumulated, right? On whose back was that wealth earned? And now we are part of these institutions and making decisions about how that money is given out. And where we see those colonial dynamics showing up is one, who gets to make decisions around how investments are managed, who gets to allocate that money, and who's benefiting from that money. We see still a very small percentage of philanthropic dollars being invested in communities of color. And I feel that that's, thank you. It feels really sort of an injustice when you think about the history and the role that communities of color have played in the margins in helping to build wealth around the world through genocide and stolen land, things that are kind of uncomfortable to discuss, but it's a reality that wealth was accumulated in this ways in many places. And so we owe it to ourselves, those of us who manage and allocate funds and invest philanthropic dollars, we owe it to ourselves to understand the history of how wealth was accumulated, and then to allocate and invest and give money away in a way that respects that history.
Yeah. It's such a beautiful perspective. So speaking of how wealth was accumulated and who controls it, you talk a lot about how white the philanthropic sector is and how little money is flowing to communities of color and how there's just a status quo that's being perpetuated. So what do you mean by worshiping the status quo and how that plays out in philanthropy?
Wow, worshiping the status quo. I think of sort of the opposite of the status quo is progress or change, right? And change is hard for all of us. It's not, we have to get really uncomfortable with change. And I think within philanthropy, there can be quite a bit of comfort working in those institutions. I did not come from wealth, obviously, and have to admit that I have been quite comfortable working in the field with the perks and the incentives that it provides. However, I think to see change happen, and especially in those institutions that are in some ways like a bubble of privilege, like a microcosm of privilege and wealth, we have to be willing to get uncomfortable. And sometimes actually super uncomfortable and lean into that discomfort in order to see change happen. And where we need to see change happen is in so many ways, but you mentioned sort of whiteness, and of course where we see where white folks around the world hold the majority of wealth. Therefore, foundations that are started are most often started by white folks who then sit at the leadership of foundations. The majority of foundation boards in the US are white men. The majority of CEOs of foundations are white folks, the majority of staff. And then you see about 95% of grant-making dollars going to institutions that are white-led. And so we have to really examine that. And if we really want to see change happen, as we heard earlier today, change is happening in the margins. There's a lot of solutions and really good ideas and brave thinking happening from folks who have not been privileged to be a part of those circles. And we need to tap into that in order to see change. And that means shifting the status quo.
Absolutely. So I'm also curious about how, of course, your book and your experience are largely American. I live in Nairobi, Kenya, which is also sometimes called the Silicon Savannah. Some other people are from Nairobi here. And so it's called the Silicon Savannah sometimes because of the large number of social enterprises there and a lot of the change making that's taking place. Though even within those circles and even within who gets funding there, I feel like I see a lot of these themes that you're mentioning be replicated over there. So I'm wondering if you've seen in any ways that your findings while writing the book, how they may translate internationally.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The concepts in the book, when we're talking about colonization, I mean, that's a global phenomenon, right? It's something that's been happening. And there's also this idea of what I call global bleaching, which is really this forced assimilation, as we were saying earlier, this force to take out anything that is not, sort of the dominant culture. And so we see languages, being erased. We see cultures being erased. We see people that are not in power being eradicated. This is still happening around the world. And we may not see in some places colonization happening in quite the literal visual way that you might be imagining it, but it's still happening in subtle ways because as like any virus, the colonizing virus mutates and expands to different ways of operating. And so we have to be really attuned to those dynamics at play. So absolutely what's happened in the U.S., foundations in many instances are a U.S. construct because of our tax system there that allows major incentives to start foundations. But the dynamics of colonization, the dynamics of white supremacy that show up in our policies and systems and who haves and who have not, the haves and the have-nots, is absolutely something that is across the board in every country where we see people who are in power and people who are not in power and who controls resources.
So thank you so much. So I'm so grateful that the second half of your book is focused not just on the problem and all of these really deep-seated issues that you're talking about, but the second half of the book is called How to Heal. And it's a very difficult, long process. I don't want to just try to say that, just follow these 5 easy steps and you're there. But there are things that people can do in their everyday lives to actually think about decolonizing themselves and actually healing. And one of the themes that I really love that you talk about is how money for so long has been used in many ways to divide and to exploit, but that we can redirect money and that it's not, that money itself has no value, it only has the value that we attach to it, and that money can be used to heal and to love. So I'd love to know a little bit more about what you mean about that.
Sure. So, being Native American, working in philanthropy now for 15 years, which I know I don't look a day above 30, right? But, I'm a rare phenomenon, a Native American from a poor family that works in philanthropy. And I think when I started, there were about 10 of us in the U.S., and I think there's probably 25 now. We're growing in numbers. And so, I came into this work because I really wanted to see change in communities, right? Passionate about change. I was hired because of my experience, real world experience in the communities that these foundations cared for. And it wasn't very long before I became very frustrated and felt a lot of pain actually about trying to do this work that, with an institutions that had a mission for change and, even social justice, but the actual realities of doing that work were quite complicated. This is complicated work. There are a lot of contradictions. And so initially I, at times felt even angry because I wasn't able to respond to the community in the way that I wanted to. And I was caught in the middle in a sense, right? Because I worked inside the bubble of privilege, but I was also accountable to my own community. And that frustration at one point even became anger. And I had a sense of a loss of my own identity because I had assimilated so much to the type of leadership that had been modeled to me, what had been lifted up as a good leader. And when I took a break from working in philanthropy for a little while, in writing this book, I went back to my home community, the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina, and just immersed myself in my culture, talking to my relatives, talking to elders in my community, and I asked questions like, what is philanthropy? No one knew what that word was. So like, what does that word mean? But what I realized, during that time is that the way out of this for all of us, not just for me, but for all of us, the way out of this was really an indigenous perspective, indigenous wisdom of really understanding that we all have a gift, a contribution, right? And I know that in the audience tonight, you all are entrepreneurs and you have a gift and a calling, something that you feel really led to do to make the world a better place. And I was conflicted because I was like, my gift is like moving money. Like, isn't money like bad and dirty, or like there's a lot of negative connotations with that? And I had an elder to say to me that the medicine that had chosen me was money. And in my culture, we say that you don't choose your medicine, the medicine chooses you. And so I had this paradox moment where I had to understand that the medicine that chose me was money. And by medicine, what we mean in our culture is that something that is sacred, something that is brings balance to you, something that's a life-giving force for your vehicle for change in the world. And so at the moment that I realized that it wasn't about the money was neutral. Money is just a proxy for relationships. It's a symbol for something. Money has been used wrong in the past. It's been used to dominate, to oppress, to separate, to divide. But we all have a choice that we can make, that we can use money as medicine. We can use money to facilitate healing, connection, belonging, and actually responding to the harm and the trauma that has been left behind from colonization by moving money in ways that help to heal that past, by moving money to where the hurt is the worst, and that is in communities of color.
That's so beautiful. Thank you. So that leads me so well into this quote that I have from your book regarding proximity, which was actually, I believe, last year's Skoll World Forum theme about the power of proximity. And you talk about, just being in communities. So you write, deep, authentic knowledge does not come from reading statistics or reports. It doesn't even come from a site visit to a community center or interviewing someone from the affected community. It comes from living inside that community and experiencing that issue for oneself, period. So tell me more about the power of proximity and being with community in order to facilitate this healing process.
Proximity is everything. We are all traumatized by history, right? Even folks who may be descendants of colonizers, there's trauma that is left behind with all of us by subscribing to that idea of dominance, of oppression, for participating in various ways, however our ancestors may have been a part of that, right? And so when we fast forward now to the 21st century, we're all here and we all have experienced pain as human beings. We've all experienced trauma. And so there's the opportunity to think about how can we get in community with each other, although we may be very different, right? But understand that those of us who are from the margins, those of us who have long histories of being resilient, right? Like my tribe, we are resilient. 500 years and we're still here, right? And so we kind of have a corner on resilience in a lot of ways, right? So understand that when you come from privilege, often that privilege can blind you to solutions that work for everyone. And so it's not a license to cop out. We all have a role to play in decolonization. We all have a role to play in healing. We all have a role to play in shifting our thinking to a way that's not a white dominant way of thinking, but a way that is inclusive of all perspectives. And that's only going to happen when we sit down together and begin a conversation around things that are often uncomfortable.
Yeah, absolutely. Here's to getting uncomfortable. So that leads me actually, I would love for you to leave the audience with some actual practical advice. So this beautiful, amazing audience here today includes many philanthropists, includes many social entrepreneurs, community organizers, nonprofit leaders, and there's a lot of conversations that happen. There's a lot of conversations between people with money and people looking for money that happen this week. So what are a couple of things that you think in particular the philanthropists in the audience can do this week to begin to put some of these ideas into practice, to begin to decolonize themselves?
You know, I think acknowledging the power dynamic that I understand that some deals might be happening this week, right? And so let's move beyond the transactional relationship with each other. Talk business, make your pitches, whatever we all are going to do this week, but let's try to see each other as human beings, right? No one's an ATM, no one is a person who's an asker or a taker, right? Let's come together around centering communities, centering change that needs to happen across this globe, and try to start there around some connection. I think we often sit down and there's the anxiety of like, I'm going to be asked for something that I can't give, or I need these resources. If we can kind of put that game and that dance aside to really connect with each other on a very personal level, that is actually what decolonization is. It's actually just radical listening, radical connecting with each other. Put your phones down for a minute and engage with each other as human beings. Listen to the stories of folks that come from a different community than you. Allow your mind to be open. If you feel uncomfortable, lean into that and just sit in that and know, wow, like I'm actually growing and stretching as a person because I feel uncomfortable. Those are all parts of decolonization. It's not that radical or sophisticated of a notion. When you think about it, it's actually just going back to a state of being in a circle together, understanding the concept of all my relations. We are all related, right? Our suffering is mutual and our thriving is mutual.
Thank you so much. So I hope this week, if any of you do feel uncomfortable, that you do lean into it, that it is ultimately productive. Don't shy away from it, don't run away, but actually think to yourself, is this a meeting I would have normally? And maybe take something that you wouldn't do. So thank you again so much, Edgar.
Absolutely, it's an honor to talk with you all.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.